Eric, I am so thrilled to have you on 20-Minute Playbook. Thank you so much for joining me and for coming on.
Likewise. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here. The first question I always love to start with, and this is more the rapid fire interview type we're going to do, is I'd love to start with a recent curiosity or fascination. And, so what I'm curious is what question or idea have you been pondering, or what have you been fascinated by recently? What's on your mind?
Good question. I think the thing that I've been thinking about the most recently is, I'm constantly thinking about venture and firm building and all those kinds of aspects, right? I think most recently what's been top of mind for me is kind of like, where do we go from here in the venture world, right? I think last year was such a crazy year, but it felt like one of those years where everybody kind of knew it, right? And I think oftentimes you can you look back even 10, 20 years ago, right? Or kind of like the first .com, kind of bust and most of the money gets made in these weird kind of decade-long bull cycles in the last couple of years, right? And so you have this kind of tacit acknowledgement from everybody that, yes, it's crazy, but we're still going to play the game until the music stops, right? And so that was really like emblematic of last year, right? And this year, obviously, there's been a tremendous hollowing out, and I think by many stretches, actually just kind of reverting to the mean, which I think is good and healthy and all those kinds of things, right? But I think some could argue that tech is even oversold. A lot of companies down 70, 80, 90%, right? Over the past 12 months.
Massive.
Yeah. And so then it's kind of like, well, what happens from here, right? And whether that's startup valuations, whether that's fundraising for GPs, whether that's kind of like for the market writ large, like how long does it take for us to kind of recover from kind of what we're experiencing right now, and how do you best play that, both as a startup founder but also as a fund manager, and yeah, so I think that's been on my mind quite a bit, and there's so many different moving factors there, right? You have the macro, you have how founders are operating and thinking, you have how like LPs are operating and thinking, how GPs are operating and thinking, right? And all of that kind of combines into like the startup and venture machine, right? So yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot lately.
I mean, it's fascinating. And it is, it's been on my mind as well, too, because it does feel like two things maybe to point out. One, a lot of VCs that I talk to, obviously agree. I haven't talked to a single person that hasn't seen just a massive, swing and felt this massive swing emotionally, mentally, psychologically, all of it. But what's interesting is, a couple of people have cited that part of what is so exacerbating about this particular one is that it's really played out in like 6 months from the end of Q1 until maybe where we are today, and that really startup valuations didn't start tipping over until the end of Q1. So there's just the speed. And then the second piece is there's so many moving factors to your point. And there's the rise of inflation. There's much higher rates. What does that mean for startups going forward? Anyway, so I'm glad you're thinking about it. If you have any secrets, once you start figuring this out, please share them on Twitter so we can all learn from you.
I will. The one thing I will say is, I think everybody, maybe not everybody, but there have been a lot of people who I remember I think I tweeted this recently, actually, I think, I remember even in February or March or April, a lot of people out there were like, like this will, blow over by the summer, by the fall, like we'll be back to normal, whatever. Right. And I mean, number one, obviously that's not happened. But I think number two is like, this isn't going to change for a while. Right. I mean, and I think what a while means is I think, frankly, like I do not know. Right. But I think very clearly, next year is going to be painful as well. Right. I mean, there's no world at this point where we haven't even started to stabilize the macro yet, I guess is my point. Right. And you think about inflation or just like the broader macro, and like it feels like things are going to continue getting worse before they get better. Right. And then you think about where, early stage venture falls into that equation, right? And I mean, early stage venture has probably the single biggest lag relative to, any kind of private markets or even public for that matter, like asset class out there. It's probably a good 6 to 9 month lag, right, on these things before it hits early stage venture. And so, even if things magically kind of snapped and changed today, right, you're probably looking at the middle of next year before there's any kind of normalization. And so it really does seem like it's going to be 2024 at the earliest, but before I think things kind of start to bottom out and pick up. So that's how we're thinking at Contrary. Is I think we're going to be in for quite a while still. So.
Yeah. You don't know how long, but definitely more likely years than months, I think, at this point, especially in time. I want to move on and, we're going to do a much longer form interview all around Contrary, which, I'm thrilled to do. I think what you're building is a fascinatingly different type of venture firm. But, one of the big ideas is that you're focused on identifying and investing in the world's top talent. And so one of the questions that I wanted to ask is, what has being so talent focused taught you about what the world's most talented people share in terms of traits, in terms of approach? What have you learned about the commonalities of talent?
Yeah, for sure. So several things, but I think number one is that often starts very early in someone's journey, right? So I think one of the core insights that we've been able to extract now doing this for the past 3, 4, 5 years is that, for us, we're looking for people who are, likely future founders, right? So there's kind of this tech startup lens that we're viewing things through, but nonetheless, exceptional people are exhibiting unique traits very early in their journeys, right? And so the way we think about it actually is we have entire kind of conviction in this idea of by the time somebody finds themselves in college, they've very likely already done something exceptional in their lives if they're the kind of person that we want to back. Or that we want to have as a part of our fellowship program, or that we want to, kind of get to know wherever it might be. And quite often it's not that they started a company, right? In fact, it's typically not the case. But maybe they were a world-class pianist or athlete or whatever it might be. There's some demonstrable level of grit that they've exhibited, and they have a very kind of clear and lucid articulation of what they want to do moving forward as well. I think that for us, like above anything else, like that is probably the single most powerful kind of like trait and characteristic that we've learned about folks is it starts early. And sure, I imagine there are a number of late bloomers or whatever, so to speak, that we maybe we miss on or whatever. But I think by and large, it is a trait that kind of starts early. So I think that's number one. And then I think number two is, again, these people know what they want to do. They have a very clear sense of kind of like the mark that they're going to imprint on the world, right? And so if you go and talk with the right people, they're the kind of person that Contrary is looking to get in front of, they'll say some version of, I'm working at Startup X right now because I want to understand these 3 things, right? I want to understand what it takes to fundraise. I want to understand kind of like what it takes to be a great manager, and I want to learn on kind of under the auspices of somebody maybe who's already been there and done that, serial founder, sold a company before. And more than anything, I want to learn what it takes to build a hyper-growth startup on somebody else's dime and reputation, right? And I want to do that for 1 or 2 or 3 years. And after that, I think those are the 3 most important pieces of the puzzle that I think I want to understand before kind of going and starting my own company. And so in a year or 2, I'm going to quit and I'm going to start my own company and then that, right? And they say it very matter of factly, right? Like there's no doubt, right? Like this is what will happen.
It's not iffy.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's rare when you kind of even talk. I mean, you talk to people who are 40, 50, 60 years old, right? And they don't have that level of conviction, I think, in like what they are unequivocally going to do. So I think those are the 2 most important kind of like traits that we've been able to kind of suss out. Obviously, there are many more. You could talk about, somebody's technical ability or things like that. But I think more than anything else is like it starts early, and these are people who have conviction, not only in themselves, but I think in kind of what they want to do.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I would not have picked those 2. Although, I think conviction is synonymous with self-confidence. So sure, maybe that one is there. I want to ask a very different question, which is if people following could shadow you for a day from the moment you wake up until you go to bed, as creepy as that might be, what do you think they would be most surprised by? And I think, what we're trying to get at there is what's unique about the way you approach work, the way you approach life, the way you, go about your day, any of those.
Am I allowed to say 2 things?
Yeah, of course. Always.
So I think number 1 would how much sleep I get.
It's a good start.
Yeah. So So I think for me at least, this has been the single most important factor that's prevented burnout over the past now 5 years of 5+ years of building Contrary. I think to be very clear, I still work a ton, right? I work 6.5 out of 7 days a week, right? Like oftentimes kind of 12+ hour days, but I do little else other than work, sleep, and spend any free remaining time that I can with close family and friends. And that is my life, right? And what I found though over the years, even in the very early days of Contrary, when I was working, even more than I am today, I could work 12, 13, 14, 15 hours a day, right? But if I were able to get, 8, sometimes 9 hours of sleep a night, like I would wake up the next morning and just be ready to get after it. Right. And there would be no missing a beat, no burnout, no exhaustion, no, dread kind of going into a new day. It was always just kind of like excitement, energy, enthusiasm. And I was able to kind of like really attack the day rather than kind of feel this sense of like, again, kind of like dread going into it. And so for me, 4 or 5 years in, like I love Contrary just as much as ever. And I largely attribute that to the fact that I've never felt that way. Right. I've never felt that sense of burnout or dread or exhaustion. And I owe it largely to sleep, right? Maybe partially it's my own demeanor, but I think sleep is a really, really big kind of piece of the puzzle. And so I think that's number one. And then number two is probably just the amount of times in a given day that I do the same thing. And what I mean by that is like that I tell the contrary story, right? I think when my fiance kind of jokes that she could kind of repeat the entire Contrary playbook at this point because of how many times she's heard me say different versions of the same thing, right, over the years. But there's a lot of repetition in the role, right? Because you are selling, right? You're selling to everyone, right? You're selling to potential hires, to potential founders, to potential investors in the fund, to journalists, to whomever, right? At the end of the day, like you're telling the story of your organization as a CEO. That is your job, right? And so there's a lot of repetition, and I think maybe that doesn't sound glamorous or exciting or interesting, but I think that's what it takes, right? I mean, go talk to any presidential candidate, right? And how many times in a given day do they say the same stump speech, right? It's no different. So yeah.
Yeah, you can't ever get tired of telling that story. I feel like it's a core skill. I want to ask one follow-up question on the sleep piece, which is, I guess 2 thoughts. One is, I imagine, at least for myself, I find it hard at the end of the day to shut off my mind. Do you find it hard to shut off your mind? And along with that, is there anything you've done to optimize sleep?
Yeah, it's super challenging I'd say, once I've stopped work, I don't know, whatever time that might be, 8, 9, 10, right? I think for me, the trick has been to just do something else, right? Whether that's like watch an episode of The Office or, talk with my fiance about how her day was, or you kind of do something to just stop, right? And I've tried to be very deliberate about this where I can. It's not always possible, right? Sometimes there's something that's just kind of wrangling, or there's something that's not good that's going on or whatever, and it does become a little bit all consuming. But I try to kind of pick a moment in the evening, depending on energy level, whatever, where I'm just done, right? And I will no longer for the rest of that evening talk about something work related. And so I kind of have this like social contract that, to the best of my ability, like I try to enforce with my fiance, right? And I think that's worked reasonably well. And so by the time you end up getting to bed, 1 or 2, whatever hours later, you can kind of, for me at least, I have the ability to just kind of shut off and move forward and kind of turn the page the next day. I'm not somebody who often will kind of stew before they go to bed. So I think for me, it's just been kind of drawing that line in the sand, but I think it's hard for a lot of people. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways it sounds obvious, but it sounds, very intuitive, very logical, that of course you just need to figure out how to draw a line in the sand and be able to do that as intentionally as possible.
Yeah, you have to. I mean, and maybe this is kind of like something that I think that I having, discussed this with a lot of friends or whatever, is like, I think that this is something that I'm better at than most people is knowing how and when to shut off. And that can be, at the end of an evening, right? That can be on a Saturday afternoon, or that can be on like vacation, right? Like, as an example, right? Like we went to Iceland this past, summer, right? For a few days off. And, by and large, I was able to say, okay, I'm on vacation. I'm done, right? Like, I'm shutting my phone off. And for these 3 or 4 or 5 days, like, I'm, going to do, to the best of my possible ability, right? Like, not think or look at my phone and move on, right? My fiance, like, could not do that. Like, literally we would be at any, at any kind of area where there's a Wi-Fi hotspot or something, right? And just had to be kind of like engaged on the phone, whatever. And so I think for me, I mean, it's a superpower, maybe that's whatever. It's I am almost always on, but then just having an ability to kind of know when is enough and turn the page. So, yeah.
Yeah. I want to ask a question about, values and standards. And, you talked about, which makes sense, that you're working 12 hours days, 10, 12-hour days, say 6.5 days per week. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask is, what sorts of values and standards do you bring to your work? What's important to you about how you show up day to day? And this could be for your team at Contrary, for the founders you work with, for the investors you work with. What comes to mind?
Yeah, I kind of view this through 2 lenses, right? I view this through the lens of what is the business that we are in? And number 2, what do I expect for not only myself, but also the team and the Contrary culture that we want to build, right? So I think if you kind of look at it through that first piece of kind of what are we in the business of, at the end of the day, we're in the business of serving founders, right? And so what that means is you never stop, right? I have to be just as available for somebody on, a Monday at 1:30 as I do a Saturday at 7 a.m., right? And so like you are in the business of serving and helping founders, and that never ends, right? Like that is a 5-decade, long kind of commitment. And it's something that I think and by extension, we as a firm take very, very seriously, because this is how you earn your reputation, right? You earn your reputation. I mean, even at Contrary, we try to respond to our founders within 30 minutes, right? Whether it's text, email, Slack, like you name it, like 30-minute SLA, right? And it's the difference between that hyper responsiveness and not, which often determines, number one, how founders think about you and your reputation and brand and all of those things, but also who they go to first, right? Who they go to first when they have a really important hiring decision or firing decision, when they're thinking about their fundraise, when they get their very first term sheet, right? And they want somebody to run it by you. Like, you earn that trust and that ability to be somebody's first call, right? It doesn't just happen, and it's very easily lost as well, conversely, right? So I think that's number one. And then on the firm side of the equation for us, we talk a lot at Contrary about building a culture of really kind of 3 characteristics. I think for us, it's are you ambitious? Are you entrepreneurial? But are you kind? I think for us, those are the 3 traits that we value the most. Is, we want people that are going to work super hard. We want people that are creative and are trying to build, kind of one of the best venture firms of our generation. But we also want good people, right? We also want to create an environment where, nobody's trying to step on somebody's toes, and it really feels like a team, and like we're building something special together. That being the operative word, right? Like, there are a lot of ambitious entrepreneurial people out there who are like real assholes, right? And those are people that we don't want at Contrary. So I think that's really kind of how we think about it.
I love the second part of your answer, because especially preparing for this, doing a little bit more research on your team, that does show up and it does come through. I mean, they're all very smart, ambitious, very talented people, but no one there seems to have any ego in a negative way.
Yeah, we do our best, and we weed it out early if we can. Yeah.
There we go. I want to ask, maybe a similar but different question. And it's, where I want to talk about the areas where you feel like you have an edge or a superpower. And this is particularly about you. You have a really interesting background. You've done quite a bit of building and investing in some very different roles. What do you think of as your superpowers, and how do those show up day to day in your work and life?
Yeah. So I think for me on a personal level, I think part of it is actually what we just talked about, right? Which is I think, I'm now 5+ years in, and I get even more joy from Contrary than I think we did the day that I started. And so that kind of leads to this kind of natural extension of that, which is, Contrary is my life's work. And I think when you know that you're going to be building something for a multi-decade period, you can think on incredibly long time horizons. And so for me, I'm not trying to flip Contrary, right? This isn't a 3, 4, 5-year endeavor, right? In fact, I've already been working on it for 5 years, right? This is a 10, 15, 20, 30-year endeavor, right? And so, I think we have tremendous conviction in kind of like the North Star and kind of like what we're building towards. And it allows me to think on really, really long-term time horizons and know that, the day-to-day competitors, competition, whatever, it's largely irrelevant, right? And when you think on those kinds of horizons. So I think that's number one. And, I think number two is just this kind of startup ethos, I think that we infuse into everything that we do. We run Contrary like a startup. I didn't pay myself a dime for the first 5 years of Contrary's journey. And even today, I'm the lowest paid person at the firm. And I think there are many, 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 in fact, probably basically all, other VCs or GPs who don't operate their firms that way, right? And so I think that gives us a tremendous edge on those firms in terms of our ability to kind of scale, build the firm, how we operate, how fast we move, products that we launch, right? And it allows us to kind of like leave a lot of those folks in our wake. So I think those two things are probably for me the most important pieces of the puzzle. Yeah.
I want to switch tacks and talk a little bit about favorite books. I don't know if in the 10, 12 hours, that you're working in a given day, if that leaves much time for reading. Maybe it's more short form than long form. But, when you think about books that have had an outsized impact on you, and this can be related to investing, related to founding and building companies, it can be science fiction. What comes to mind, and what are some of your favorite books?
Yeah. So I definitely don't have a lot of time to read in the day-to-day, although it's funny, I probably read the most on flights, actually, because it still feels like this kind of last bastion of I'm sure until Starlink or somebody kind of, makes kind of high quality Wi-Fi in flights, in which case I'll just kind of, keep doing work. But I do a lot of my reading on flights when I can. And I think for me, probably the most powerful, or one of the most powerful books that I've ever read is this book called The Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley. Have you read it?
I have not, but I have it purchased and it's on my list. So yes, it's good not to get to it.
Yeah, definitely going to read. Yeah. So I think for me, it was powerful because, we live in a world that is pretty consistently negative from kind of the bottom to the top. Right? If you ask people, how do they feel about their daily lives, or how do they feel about kind of how the world is progressing, all the way up through, our politicians and leaders, right? Or the nightly news, right? Like it's often quite negative. But when you actually take a step back, and this is kind of the core underlying tenet, I think, of the book, when you actually take a step back and look at the data, I think humanity is on this inexorable path forward of abundance and positivity. And there's no doubt across almost any cross-section, whether it's war or energy or you name it, right? Like food, it doesn't matter. We are dramatically better off than we were even 50 years ago, right? And so I think for me, it's an important book because it makes you realize, hey, kind of so much of what's being said, talked about, written about, whatever, is actually just wrong when you kind of look at the data, and it makes me far more positive and optimistic, I think, about humanity and human progress, and kind of understanding that like kind of we are marching forward. I think kind of like far faster than it seems like in the day to day. So.
I love that. It's a good recommendation for me to read the book. And we'll make sure to include that in the show notes so everyone else can find it as well, too. I want to ask two closing questions. And one, maybe this is related to sleep, although I'm thinking maybe you have another one. But the first question I want to ask is about a tiny habit that's had the biggest positive impact in your life. And, what I'm kind of thinking of there is anything from nightly reflection, planning your day each morning, setting an intention before meetings. Just is there any small kind of work hygiene thing that's had a very positive impact?
I guess you're gonna throw your curveball. It's not a work hygiene so much as it's kind of maybe a life hygiene. So I have, I've been really fortunate, I think, to have kind of 4 very close childhood friends. And so I mean, we grew up together, right? I mean, I was in kindergarten with one of them, right? And we're now, it's been 25 years, right, that we've already been close friends. And there's not a single day that goes by where we don't all talk with one another in some way, shape, or form, right? And that, whether that's text or, over the weekend, we played a couple of quick games of like virtual hearts, right? Or, we do a couple trips every year, right? Like, we try to be incredibly intentional about talking literally every single day. And it can be, a couple of quick texts or whatever it might be. But, I think when you're building something, right, and kind of like when you're in the thick of it, whether it's a fund or a startup or whatever, right, having a support network is really important. Right. And for many people, right, this is, friends or significant others or, whatever it might be. And I think I'm fortunate to have, a family as well that's been super supportive throughout the journey. But I think having my kind of 4 close friends and having like a group of people that you talk to every single day, it's been really powerful because I know that I don't need much else at the end of the day. Right. I already have my close friends. I already have my family. I already have, my fiance, right? Like I can dedicate all of my other energy to building Contrary, and that's it. Right. And it's as simple as that. And so I think for me, like that's been kind of one of life's greatest blessings. And I think it's a very powerful hack. And I think something that I feel fortunate to have because as I talk to more people, whatever, like I think there are a lot of people who don't have that. So yeah, I've been very fortunate in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I love that answer, and it's also not an answer I've ever heard before. So I think it is somewhat rare in a wonderful way. Okay, last question. If you could go back to the start of your career, maybe for you, it's even going back to college, and whisper some words of advice, reminder, something, anything that you'd like yourself to remember, maybe to approach life differently or just to have in mind to go through the journey. Is there anything you would tell your younger self? The advice you would give?
Yeah, I think 2 things. I think number 1 is brands matter. And I think number 2 is people vouching for you matters. I think those have been perhaps the 2 biggest lessons of kind of the entrepreneurial journey or certainly the firm building journey over the past kind of, 5 or so years is I think this is probably a little bit less true in the startup world than it is the financial services business, right? So whether that's hedge funds, PE funds, venture funds, you name it. But those 2 things, kind of brands and vouching, in the venture world are, I think when you really boil it down, some of the only things that matter, right? I think because it essentially translates to credibility. And when it's really interesting. I made a conscious choice early in my career to not do that, to not seek out. I've never worked at a brand name place in my entire life, right? And that was intentional. And it was intentional because I was always optimizing for the velocity of learning. And the velocity of learning is the greatest oftentimes at non-brand name places, because by definition, you're not a part of a machine, right? You're a part of building something. And so you're learning while building, right? And so that's actually very, very powerful. And I would recommend everybody do a bit of that wherever you can. But I think ultimately, not having, worked at top venture fund X, or, going to top school X, or, not having, some very kind of name brand, well-connected person being able to kind of vouch for you in the very early days of building something, I think hurt in retrospect. And so when I think about kind of like the things that I would do differently, I think you always have this kind of youthful naivete when you go into anything, which I think is great, actually, because I think a lot of things wouldn't happen otherwise. But when you go into it, in retrospect, I should have focused a little bit more on that than I did. And unfortunately, today it's kind of no longer an issue, right? But I think it cost us time in the early days. And so I think that is kind of a piece of advice that I would give myself is, Eric, don't be so confident in your abilities alone, right? At the end of the day, humans look for other heuristics and kind of like ways of attaching credibility or credence to something. And you need to also play that game in addition to to kind of blazing your own path. So.
Yeah, and I love the way you described it as playing that game, because it does feel like that a little bit, where you're kind of intentionally recognizing, one, that this is valuable, whether you agree with it or not, and two, that it's actually something that you do need to try to be good at or bias for or lean into. Perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for coming on, Eric. I appreciate it.
Great to chat. Thanks, Daniel.